that you can hear me and y'all are seeing the presentation.
We are, and I can hear you.
All right, sounds great. Well, thanks, Chip, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you guys for tuning in for the seminar today. I'm really excited to share some information from our FISHstory project, which was kind of one of the initial pilot projects that was developed under the Council Citizen Science program. And so this project is using historic photos to help kind of document and describe the for-hire catch and length estimates from a historic time period kind of prior when catch monitoring programs were in place in our South Atlantic region. And for those of you that might be familiar with the project, you know what a large role retired Captain Rusty Hudson has played in the project. And I just wanted to mention that kind of the center image here is of him as a young child with a red snapper. And before getting into details of the project itself, I just wanted to say that FISHstory was really truly a team effort and wouldn't have been possible without so many of our kind of amazing volunteers and partners. And wanted to give special thanks to Rusty Hudson, who graciously provided all the photos for this pilot project, Ken Brennan, who played a large role in kind of developing a project to analyze these photos, Amber Von Harten, who came up with the idea to apply a citizen science approach to analyzing these photos and led efforts for the grant that helped fund this work. And then two council staff members, Allie Iberly and Chip Collier. So Allie was initially hired as our FISHstory project coordinator and played a large role in the development and coordination of the project. And Chip did a lot of the heavy lifting on the analytical side of the house in the project. Also really wanted to thank our FISHstory design and validation teams, our FISHstory length analysts, and our Zooniverse volunteers. And we were also really lucky to have several outreach partners that helped us promote this project. Sea Grant, state agencies, citizen science organizations really helped us spread the word about this project. And then also wanted to thank NOAA Fisheries Information System Program, who provided a grant that helped fund this work. And so to kind of set the stage and provide a little context for this research, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the recreational fisheries in the South Atlantic. And in the South Atlantic, I'm talking from kind of the North Carolina state line, south down the east coast of Florida through the Florida Keys. And so much of the finfish harvest in kind of our region is dominated by recreational fisheries, and recreational fisheries can be kind of challenging to sample just due to the kind of sheer volume of participants and to kind of the diverse departure points that are used. And here in the South Atlantic, we have very few recreational monitoring programs in place prior to the mid-70s. So kind of the Southeast Fishery Headboat Survey started kind of in the mid to late 70s, kind of depending on your location. And then the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP, which samples kind of the charter and the private sector of the recreational fishery, started in the early 1980s. So there was really limited information on recreational fisheries kind of prior to the 1970s. However, we had kind of an indication that recreational fisheries were operating before 1970. There are a number of kind of a few publications, there's a lot of anecdotal information, and there are a number of these kind of historic photos that kind of show that recreational fishing was happening prior to this date. And so learning more about the catch and size information could help improve our understanding of these historic fisheries. And I think it's important to note too that in kind of the South Atlantic region, we have a number of stock assessments that start prior to 1970. And so having more information on these historic fisheries could really help inform some of our stock assessments. And so for hire fleets, as many of you guys probably know, have a long-standing tradition of kind of bringing the day's catch back to the dock, kind of displaying it up on a leaderboard, and then having the customers kind of take a commemorative photo in front of it. And so photos like this aren't incorporated into our current data collection program. So they really serve as kind of this untapped source of information. And they really have the potential to provide some quantifiable information on species and length composition data at kind of a point in time when fishery dependent surveys for the for hire for hire fleets didn't exist in our region. And so that's kind of the FISHstory project was born. And before I start getting into kind of details on the FISHstory project, I wanted to talk just for a minute about kind of the development of the project in general. And so the Council Citizen Science Program is really working to kind of bring fishermen and scientists together to design and build projects that are based on the Council's research needs. And so when the program was developed, it developed a number of kind of standards and project kind of support resources to kind of help folks develop projects so that the data could be meet their intended use and be informative to management. And so the FISHstory project kind of followed these standards, and I wanted to kind of mention 4 things that we did that I think were really kind of helpful in the development of this project. The first is that we tried to meet an identified citizen science council research priority. And so the council had a research priority of trying to use historic photos to help us get more information on the recreational fisheries from this kind of historic time period. We also used a diverse group of stakeholders, which we refer to as our design team, to help develop the project. So we had kind of fishery scientists, fish identification experts, fishermen, and kind of outreach specialists working together to design this project. And having people with so many different expertise, I think, can help give projects a greater chance of success. As we were designing the project, we also consulted with kind of the data end users along the way. And so we consulted with the council's scientific advisors and some stock assessment scientists. And I think that was really helpful to help ensure that we were kind of designing the project in a way where the data can meet their intended use. And it also helped us identify barriers that we can take in consideration as we try to kind of move the project forward. And then we also incorporated feedback from experts. And so an example of that is we got input from volunteers as we were developing the project. And I think that helped kind of strengthen what we were able to do, particularly for the for-hire catch composition component of the project. And so the FISHstory project itself was made up of kind of 3 main components. The first was to kind of digitize and archive historic photos. So as part of this pilot project, over 1,370 photos were digitized and archived. The second component of the project focused on collecting information on for-hire catch composition from the photos. And to do that, we used an online crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. So as part of this component of the project, we had over 2,100 volunteers that made over 35,700 individual classifications. So those are individual kind of counts of fish or people within a photo. And then we also had a validation team that was made up of fish ID experts that helped review photos when there was substantial volunteer disagreement. And that group reviewed 180 photos. And then for the last component of the project, we really focused on developing a method to estimate fish length within these photos. And then we pilot tested that on king mackerel. And so as part of this pilot, all of the photos we had in our photo set were reviewed and measured for king mackerel, and we were able to develop length compositions. So now I'm going to kind of walk through each of the components of the project, kind of sharing a little bit about the processes we developed, share some of our key findings, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of lessons learned and key takeaways that we learned through this pilot. And so the first component of the project, I'm going to be talking about kind of archiving these historic photos, and wanted to give you kind of an overview of the photos that were part of this pilot project. And I can't do that without sharing some information about Rusty Hudson. And so Rusty is kind of a retired commercial and recreational fisherman from Florida, and he kind of serves as his family's historian. And so the photos in the FISHstory project were provided and digitized by Rusty, and they really represent his family's fishing fleet. So the Hudson, the Stone, and the Timmins families. And as part of this project, 1,374 photos were digitized and archived for analysis. And so the photos really can give us a description of the beginnings of the for-hire fishery in the Daytona Beach area of Florida, where Rusty and his families are from. And so the date range of the photos that we gathered as part of this project are from 1949 to 1975. If you look at kind of the donut chart on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the percentage of photos by decade. So the majority of photos came from the 1960s, so about 67% of the photos. Then you had kind of an equal percentage from the 1950s to 1970s, and there was a small amount, about 4%, that didn't have a year associated with them. And the photos really represent trips taken from all months, with the most photos occurring from kind of April to August, which likely mimics the effort across the vessels in this fleet. The photos for this pilot project were all from the Daytona Beach, Florida area. And they mainly are cover photos from fishing trips that departed from kind of Inlet Harbor and Timmins Fish Camp. And so if you look at the map on kind of the right hand of the screen, you can see that orange star, and that approximates the locations of those two locales. And so there's still charter trips leaving from Inlet Harbor, and Timmins Fish Camp today has actually turned into a restaurant called Down the Hatch. And so there are at least 17 vessels that are represented in the photos over this time period, but the majority of photos were from the 5 vessels that you can see here on the screen. The Flamingo, the Mako, the Broadbill, the Miss Juanita, and the Marianne. And so before going into kind of the second component of the project, I wanted to take a second to just show you guys a couple of example photos in our FISHstory photo set to kind of show you the range of difficulty that we saw in the photo set. And so most of the pictures were black and white, and not all had very good resolution. So the photo you see on the screen right now is one that we consider kind of an easier photo. All the fish are kind of hanging clearly on the leaderboard. They're evenly spaced out. They're not overlapping or obstructing one another. There are no people obstructing fish in the photos, and there are only a couple of species. So they're kind of king mackerel and little tunny within this photo. On the other end of the spectrum is a photo like this. This is a photo that's kind of in color, but it's one of the ones we would say is kind of more challenging within our photo set. There are a ton of species. The resolution in the photo isn't that great. If you look closely, you can see stringers of fish hanging on the leaderboard in the back, so they're fish obstructing one another. There's also kind of a wheelbarrow of fish, and then there are also people who are standing in front of fish, kind of obstructing your ability to kind of identify them. So there was really kind of a wide range of difficulty levels within the photo set gathered as part of this pilot project, and I think it's kind of helpful kind of sharing that as we start to talk more about our findings. So now I'm going to move on to kind of the second component of the project, which again focused on describing for-hire catch composition using the online crowdsourcing platform Zooniverse. And before getting into the FISHstory project specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the Zooniverse platform itself for any listeners who may not be familiar with it. And so Zooniverse is kind of a free online platform that allows you to build projects online and develop tutorials and training materials so that citizen scientists or volunteers from anywhere in the world are able to help you analyze images. And so the Zooniverse platform kind of supports hundreds of projects over a kind of a wide range of topics, everything from kind of identifying animals in trail cameras in Africa, to spotting clouds kind of on Mars, to transcribing historic texts. So for the FISHstory project, we really tried to focus on training volunteers to help us identify and count fish and people within our photo set. And one other thing that I think is worth noting is that it was really valuable working with kind of established partner like Zooniverse for this project. Not only did it provide kind of a free platform for us to build a project, but we were also able to get the Zooniverse staff and some of their expert volunteers provide guidance to us as we were developing the project. And it also helped connect us to a community of potential volunteers that could devote their time to the FISHstory project. And so now I'm going to move more into talking about the processes we developed for this kind of for-hire catch composition part of the project. And so since this was a pilot, a lot of our time was involved in developing processes to analyze these historic photos. And so this slide kind of shows an overview of all of the steps in the process for this component of the project. And I'm not going to go over each one in detail, but I did want to show them to emphasize that there was kind of a lot of steps in kind of developing the project and analyzing the photos as kind of this component of the project goes. And so kind of before we launched the project in Zooniverse, we had to, of course, build it. We needed to develop training materials. We needed to recruit and train validation team members. And then we beta tested the project in Zooniverse and adjusted it based on feedback we got from the Zooniverse staff and some of their kind of expert Gold Star volunteers. And then after we launched the project in May of 2020, we needed to kind of batch and add photos to it. We needed to identify photos for validation team review and coordinate that review. And then throughout the whole process, we were really focusing a lot on volunteer engagement and outreach. Then after the data were collected, we needed to analyze them. And here we are at the last step of the process now, where we're beginning to share results of what we learned through this pilot. And so to understand the findings we'll be sharing in a little bit, we thought it might be helpful to show how the data were collected in Zooniverse. And so there were kind of two tasks, or in Zooniverse language, they're called workflows, where volunteers could collect information. And so the first workflow was an easier one, where volunteers simply counted the total number of fish and the total number of people in the photos using a marking tool with different colors. So in the example photo on the screen, the green marks were what would be used to count the fish in the photos, and the blue marks are what would be used to count the people in the photos. From some of our preliminary analysis, it indicated that no validation team review were needed for these photos, and we had 10 volunteers reviewing each of these photos within this easier work plan. And then all of the photos within our photo archive were analyzed by volunteers as part of this pilot project. The second kind of workflow was more challenging, and this is where we had volunteers identify and count the fish into 16 different species groups, and also asked them to document any obstructed fish that they weren't able to identify. Since this was kind of more challenging, we decided to divide it into kind of a tiered data collection system between kind of two steps. And so the first step was focused on species that occurred kind of most frequently within the photos and were managed by the council. And so we asked volunteers to individually mark fish with different colors. And so the 4 species that were included in this kind of first step were red snapper, an amberjack species group, king mackerel, and a grouper species group. And then we also had people kind of mark any obstructed fish that they weren't able to identify in this first step. Then after this step was complete, before moving to kind of the next photo, we asked volunteers to provide bin survey counts for the remaining kind of species groups that occurred less frequently in the photos. And you can kind of see those species in the table on kind of the left-hand side of the screen. Since this was a more challenging kind of workflow, we had 20 volunteers looking at each photo, and then we had a validation team that helped review photos when there was substantial volunteer disagreement. And so as part of this pilot, we had 1,000 photos that were analyzed through this more challenging workflow. And so now I want to take a second to talk a little bit about our validation team. And so the validation team provided kind of an extra layer of review for the data that were collected through this project. And so we were really lucky to have 23 kind of members with fish ID expertise volunteer their time to help us review photos. And we really had a diverse group of folks. It was a mix of fishermen, state agency folks, federal agency folks, and researchers from universities. And so they would review photos where there was substantial volunteer disagreement. And so once the photo was kind of flagged for validation team review, we actually built kind of a separate non-public project within Zooniverse that only our validation team could get into. And so they were able to review the photos and collect and identify the fish in the photos in a similar way that our volunteers did it in the public project. And for each photo that was triggered for validation team review, we had at least 2 members review each photo independently. And then the last thing I want to mention before kind of getting into some of our findings is I wanted to talk a little bit about what an important role kind of developing training materials was in this project. So we had volunteers who had fish ID expertise. However, we also had folks volunteering for the project who didn't have much fish identification expertise. So we developed kind of a variety of different training tools, many of which we were able to do through the Zooniverse platform. So we developed kind of an online field guide that had a number of kind of example photos from the FISHstory photo set and illustrations that had photo ID tips. And we were really lucky. A lot of our validation team members helped us include some really helpful identification teams tips that we wouldn't have otherwise thought about as we were putting together this field guide. When we did the beta test in Zooniverse, we had some of their expert volunteers say, man, it would be really helpful if there was an external field guide that could accompany the project as well. So we were able to do that. Another thing we did that helped with training is Zooniverse has talk boards. And so when volunteers had questions about identifications for certain species, they could post on the talk board. And so we could kind of help with species identifications that way. And then if multiple people were having trouble with the same species, we then could include identification tips on that particular species or species group within kind of online monthly newsletters that we sent out to our volunteers. And so now I'm going to get into sharing some of our kind of findings. And the next few slides are going to have a series of box plots. So I just wanted to take a quick second to orient folks to these box plots. And we're showing the data in this way because it kind of shows a middle or median value, and it also gives you a sense of the distribution of the data. And so kind of the dark line in the center of the boxes is kind of a median or middle value. The box itself kind of shows the middle 50% of the data, and then the whiskers on the top and the bottom of the box show the interquartile ranges. So sometimes you'll see dots outside of those whiskers, and those represent data points that are 1.5 times that interquartile range. I also think it's important to note that as we were doing our kind of initial analysis of the FISHstory data, we were kind of really looking to summarize the data and look at general patterns. We haven't done any kind of statistical analyses looking at trends yet, but that's something that we're hoping to do as we work to get this work ready for publication in the future. And so with that being said, this graph shows the total landings per angler broken down into kind of 5-year time blocks. And so you can kind of see here that the kind of highest median value was found in the 1955 time block when that catch rate was above 3. It gradually declined, and then over the last kind of 3 time blocks from 1965 to 1970, kind of it hovered around 2. The next graph I'm going to show shows a comparison of counts between volunteers with those by validation team members. And so through the pilot project, we had 1,000 photos that were classified by our volunteers in this harder workflow where they were identifying fish to species or species groups. And then we had 180 of those photos reviewed by our validation team. So this graph is looking at the photos that were, those 180 photos that were reviewed by both the volunteers and our validation team. And so if you look on kind of the bottom of the plot, you can see the grouper, and you can see the species or species groupings in obstructed fish. And then if you look at the y-axis, you can see kind of the difference in counts between the 2 different groups. So the closer the difference is to 0, the more similar the groups were to each other. And so if there were positive differences, that meant that the validation team counted more of that particular species or species groups. If there was a negative difference, that meant the citizen scientists counted more of that particular species or species group. And so when looking at this kind of as a whole, you can see that the agreement between the volunteers and the validation team was pretty good. There are very few species that had bias in counts, with a few exceptions of black sea bass and kind of the snapper other group. And in both of these cases, the validation team typically counted more than the volunteers. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. For black sea bass, they typically were hanging lower on the leaderboard, so they might have been easier for volunteers to miss. And then with the snapper other group, and that basically is any snapper other than red snapper, there could have been some kind of misidentifications with things that may have been red snapper. So the biggest differences between these two groups we saw were between kind of the black sea bass and kind of other snapper that we already discussed, and then also between the obstructed fish and red snapper. Although you didn't see the same sort of biases there as you did with black sea bass and the other snapper category. And so red snapper was one of the most frequent fish in the photos. And so they're often seen in really large quantities. So I think in around 8 of the pictures that the validation team reviewed, I think they were around 50 or so red snapper within a single photo. And so that could be playing into the variation seen there. And then with the obstructed fish category, we found out that this was pretty subjective. People identified this differently. And so we weren't really surprised to see the variation there. Another thing that's probably worth noting here is that for species that were kind of rare events or occurred less frequently in the photos, that likely kind of contributed to the smaller variation that we're seeing amongst some of those species. And so now I want to show a little bit more information on kind of the catches of 4 of the species groups that we saw very frequently in the photos, kind of the grouper and amberjack species groups, and then king mackerel and red snapper. And so these graphs show the landings per angler for these 4 species groups over these kind of 5-year time blocks. And I guess the first thing that I want to make sure to point out is that the scales are different for each of these 4 species groups. So the fish that were caught more frequently in the photos, like red snapper, had kind of a larger scale. So the scale for the red snapper graph goes from 0 to 10. And then species that were caught less frequently, like grouper, that scale bar goes from 0 to 1. And so when you look at this, you can see the median values for kind of grouper were highest in the 1960 and 1970 time blocks. For red snapper, the highest median value is in 1960. And then for king mackerel and amberjack, the median values were highest during the 50s, 1950 and 1955. And then we also looked at this data, looking at landings per angler for these 4 species group by month, combining kind of all years together to kind of look at seasonality. And so again, I'll note that the scale bars are different across these 4 species, but when you look at them, you can kind of see a similar pattern between the grouper and the red snapper, with increases kind of in the catch rates in the spring and fall. And then for king mackerel and amberjack, you can see that the median values were highest in kind of the summer months. And then one of the other things we were really interested in doing is kind of seeing how some of the information we collected with fisheries fit in with some of the information collected through the Southeast Regional Headboat Survey data. And so these two kind of different data programs don't kind of have much overlapping data at all, but we wanted to just kind of see how the data collected through FISHstory kind of looked compared to the kind of headboat survey data. And so for this graph, we're really comparing angler trips between the 2 programs, looking kind of at seasonality by decade. And so on the kind of y-axis across the bottom of the screen, you can see month, and then on the kind of on the x-axis, you can see the months, and on the y-axis, you can see the percent of angler trips. So it's giving us an idea of kind of seasonality of effort. And so in 1950, for the FISHstory project, you can see that there is very few trips in kind of the fringe months in the fall and in the winter. You can see a small peak in April, and then kind of the largest percentage of trips were occurring in July. When you look in the 60s, you see kind of a similar pattern, although you're starting to see kind of more trips in those fringe months. And then in 1970, you see a similar pattern as well. One other thing that I should note, when we were looking at the headboat survey data to try to make it comparable to the FISHstory data, we did filter it, so it just included the area from Daytona Beach to Sebastian Inlet, so we're covering similar locations. And it also just includes trips that caught fish that were frequently seen within the FISHstory photos. So when you look at the effort from the headboat survey data, you see kind of a similar pattern. The highest percent of trips is occurring in July, and you see a little bit more, trips in kind of those fringe months in the fall and in the winter. And so that's kind of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So you really see similar patterns between the two different data collection programs there. And then one other thing that we were interested in looking at, we were wanting to see kind of the relative importance of these 4 different species groups that occurred frequently within the FISHstory photos, and look at kind of the relative importance from the FISHstory photos versus kind of the headboat survey. So for this, we did this ranking kind of based on the number of fish harvested that were reported kind of through the 2 different programs. And so the first thing we noticed that it was kind of remarkably kind of consistent over time. In the 50s, mackerel were kind of ranked kind of highest out of relative importance, and then that switched to red snapper. For the headboat survey in the 80s and the 90s, you can see kind of that relative importance of red snapper staying the same, and then you can see the importance of grouper kind of ticking up in the 2000s. And so we know that kind of these rankings are definitely influenced by changes in effort or fish population, but we just wanted to get a sense of relative importance to see what it would show us from the data collected through these photographs versus the data collected through the headboat survey. And so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the last component of the project, which was focused on developing a method to estimate fish length within these photos, and then pilot tested that method on king mackerel. And so we chose to use king mackerel as kind of the test case here because they're fairly easy to ID. They were typically hanging on the leaderboards within the photos, and they occurred pretty frequently within the photos. And so we took kind of a multi-step approach to developing the method to measure fish length. And so on the screen here, you can see kind of a summary of the different steps. I'm going to talk about a few of these in more detail. But the first thing we needed to do was to identify the scalar that we would use to estimate fish length. And so we ended up going with the kind of lumber and the leaderboard, so the 2x4s or the 2x6s. And so that was our scalar, and then we developed kind of a protocol. The next step was to test that protocol with items of known length to help us gauge our accuracy and precision. And then we were really lucky to have 5 length analysts with fish identification expertise helping us measure king mackerel in these photos. So the next step was kind of training the length analysts. Then we kind of moved that into production, and we needed to coordinate the measurement of all the king mackerel in the photos that we have within our archive. And here again, we're in the last stage where we're starting to share results about what we learned. And so I wanted to give just kind of a quick overview of the protocol that we used to measure fish. And so we use the open source software ImageJ. And so the image on the screen is kind of an illustration of what a completed photo would look like with ImageJ using the protocol we developed. So first, we would take 3 reference measurements of the scalar, so of the lumber and the leaderboard. So those are kind of marked by yellow on the photograph on this screen. And so we try to take the reference measurements on the right, middle, and left side of the board, kind of bracketing the king mackerel that were within the photo. Then we had analysts measure each king mackerel in the photo. If they weren't able to measure all the king mackerel in the photo because they were obstructed or something like that, that was noted within our data sheet. And then based on the number of pixels per inch from the scalar, estimates of fish length were developed for each fish within the photo for each of the analysts. And so once we kind of developed that protocol, the next thing we did was wanted to test it out on items of known length. So Chip built us our own kind of fish leaderboard, and he hung wooden boards of known length on that board. And so using the protocol we developed, we had 2 independent readers measure those boards. And so we found that there were no significant differences among the readers. And we also found that 96% of the measurements between the readers were within 2 inches of the known board sizes. And so in the most recent South Atlantic king mackerel stock assessment, they used kind of 2-inch size bins for the length composition. So we thought that that kind of demonstrated that the protocol we developed could potentially produce measurements that were precise and accurate enough for use in assessment. And so the next thing we did was kind of train our 5 analysts on how to kind of measure and report the length information within our protocol. And so we had kind of virtual training sessions, and then we also had each analyst complete kind of a training photo set or a calibration set, as we called it. And that was kind of a standard comparison of sets of kind of randomly selected photos from our kind of photo archive. And so this allowed kind of the length analysts to practice. It allowed us to see if everyone was measuring fish the same way, and it helped us determine if there were readers had different biases. And so we found that there were not significant differences seen between 4 out of our 5 readers, but we did see some variation. And due to that variation and us not knowing kind of the true length, we decided to have each photo measured by 2 analysts, and then the size distributions were estimated using a resampling approach. And so now on to some findings. So as part of this component of the project, all of the photos in our archive were reviewed for king mackerel measurements. King mackerel occurred in about 42% of the photos. And so some photos had 0 king mackerel and some had up to 54 king mackerel. And so we can produce kind of annual size distributions, although sample size does vary by year. But here we just wanted to show kind of the modal lengths by year for the presentation, so y'all could see general trends. So the modal lengths kind of range between 19 and 37 inches fork length. And there appears to be kind of a slight increasing trend from 1958 through the end of the kind of time series in the mid-1970s. And then we also wanted to show you kind of the length compositions by decade. So in the 1950s, you can see kind of the peak occurring around 29 inches fork length. In the 1960s, you can see that shift slightly to the left, so it's slightly smaller. And then in the 1970s, you can see that kind of shift to a little bit larger size class. And so kind of the next step here would be, again, to compare the information collected with the FISHstory kind of project with that collected from the headboat survey from kind of the similar location in Florida, just to kind of see how well they kind of may match each other. And so that's kind of a quick update on the 3 components of the project. The last thing I wanted to really quickly touch on is kind of project outreach. So I can't emphasize enough how big outreach was to this project. We use multiple avenues to kind of promote and recruit volunteers and communicate with volunteers. And again, we were really lucky to have so many partners working with us to help do this. We did everything from kind of blog posts to podcasts to presentations to newsletters to social media. And so we really put a lot of effort into outreach for this project throughout its lifetime. And so now I just wanted to hit on some of the key takeaways we had from kind of this pilot project. And I think it shows that the methods that we developed to kind of analyze these historic photos show a lot of promise, and that volunteers made really valuable contributions to analyzing these photos. I do think it's important to note that identifying fish in these historic photos is really challenging. And I think we learned a lot of things through the pilot that can help us simplify data collection, which could help us improve data quality for the project as we continue to move it forward. I think it's also important to note that citizen science isn't a no-cost endeavor, so this project required a lot more time and resources than we had anticipated. However, I think the work done in this pilot will make the project more efficient moving forward. So we've developed a lot of the processes, we've developed a lot of the code to help with the analysis. So I think it will be able to move more efficiently as we continue to grow the project. And then one of the most kind of exciting things we learned is that fishermen are really interested in sharing their historic photos and stories, and we have a lot to learn from these kind of photos and stories. Once we started sharing information about this project, there were a number of other fishermen from different locations who reached out to us and said, I have some photos that may be useful to this project. I know Rusty has already gathered some from another fisherman in his area. There have been a number of AP members that have said they have photos they could contribute, and even one of our council members has photos to contribute. So that was a really exciting kind of piece that we learned through this project. And then the last thing I just wanted to quickly mention is give you guys an idea of where kind of the next steps are for this project. And so the pilot was really successful, and so we're interested in moving it from a pilot to kind of a full-scale project. So right now we're pursuing funding so that we're able to continue and grow the project, and we're working on a proposal right now that's due in a couple of weeks with folks from the Southeast Fishery Science Center and NC State. And some of the things we're really hoping to do are to kind of expand the geographic and temporal range of the photos. So if we're able to have photos that cover kind of a broader swath of the South Atlantic region, and we're able to have kind of photos archived that go through the 1980s, it may be possible to develop kind of indices of abundance that could be informative to assessments. And if we have photos that overlap the time period where there is a headboat index, we may be able to calibrate those indices to one another. I think we'll also be able to kind of improve the efficiencies of the data collection processes and the photo processing by things we learned through the pilot. And then one of the things we're also really interested in doing is estimating the length compositions for more species within our photo set. So red snapper is kind of the next species that we really want to try to tackle on that front. And then another thing we're really interested in doing is consider kind of exploring an oral history component as part of this project. I really think we have a lot to learn from the fishermen who can provide context and share more details about these photos that are being gathered. And we have a lot to learn from them kind of about this historic kind of recreational and for hire fishery. And so with that, I just really appreciate you guys all for listening to this seminar. On the bottom of the screen, my kind of email address is there if anyone wants to reach out. And there's also a link to the FISHstory project page within our website, and which can then take you to the FISHstory project in Zooniverse if any of you guys are interested in checking it out. So again, now I'd be happy to take kind of any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Julia. If I'm going to take presentation mode back real quick.
Okay.
All right, and so once again, just showing you how to operate this webinar platform that we're on. I know many of you guys are familiar with several programs, but just a little refresher on this one. To raise your hand, if you want to ask a question, you can simply click on the icon that looks a little bit like a turkey. And you'll have it will turn red. That'll indicate that your hand is raised. After I see you've raised your hand, I'll unmute you as you in order of speaking, and the webinar will let you know that you've been unmuted. You'll need to click on the microphone yourself to make it green. That'll give you an opportunity to speak. And then finally, you can type in your questions here in the question box. And our first question is from Rusty Hudson. Rusty, you're unmuted. Rusty, it's showing you're still muted on your side. Okay, we'll come back to you, Rusty. Brian Flick.
Hey, Julia, great job. That was fascinating. Can you provide a little bit more insight, just like how you guys are envisioning ultimately being able to use this data as far as informing management decisions? Because you talked a little bit, obviously as a reference point, but is it? Do you guys feel like eventually this could be robust enough to actually help maybe look at changes in policy, or is it just maybe as a tool just to give you additional input, or all the above?
And so, thanks, Brian. Oops, sorry. That's a great question. And so, I think I'll kind of hit on this in two ways, and then I know Chip and Allie are on the line too, who are very integral to this project. So if y'all have stuff to add, just jump in here too. And so first I'll talk about kind of the linked component of the project. So again, we talk about, we have a number of stock assessments that go, that start prior to the 1970s. And so they include kind of, they're estimating historic catches. And so there is very little, if any, kind of biological, so no size information that goes along with those. So I think some of the kind of length composition information that we have could help be informative to stock assessments. We know that there was catch going on during those historic time periods, but we don't know kind of the size of that catch. And so I think some of the information gathered through this project could be helpful there. So for instance, the king mackerel stock assessment starts, I think, in 1900. And so having some information on some of what the catch looked like from that historic period could be useful. On the other side, after we did a brief presentation at the council meeting in June on this project and its findings, and one of the stock assessment scientists from the Southeast Fishery Science Center Beaufort Lab reached out and said, I think if we can expand the geographic range of the photos within the project, we may be able to develop kind of a relative index of abundance from these photos. And especially if we can expand the temporal kind of range of the photos, so it kind of overlaps with kind of the head boat survey, which is typically the earliest index of abundance that's used in the stock assessments in our region, so that we can kind of calibrate a FISHstory relative abundance survey to the head boat survey. That could be informative to assessments too. I also think it's worth noting that right now, this was a pilot project where we're testing the method, so it's a really localized area. But if we're able to kind of expand the project and get photos from a larger geographic range, I think that'll make the data more kind of applicable to be used in kind of an assessment or management context. And so I guess Allie and Chip, if y'all have anything to add in, feel free to jump in. And Brian, I hope that answered your question.
No, that was excellent. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, next up we have Rusty.
You got me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my iPad took a moment to try to load up. Plus, I had a delivery from UPS, so all at the same time. I only have a couple of notes that I wanted to share. Thank you for a great presentation, Julia and Chip, on all of this. Allie, and right on back to Amber and John Carmichael's original meeting up there at the South Atlantic Council meeting in Florida that started all this. The king mackerel is interesting. Some of the pictures, date back to the late 40s, but then there were gear type situations that ended in 1989. And so how to document the impact, because I saw some of the king mackerel catches with the airplanes and stuff there in Key West back in the 70s, mid 70s to late 70s. And even into the 80s, and then that ended in 89. A lot of stuff has changed, but one of the things that I noted as we have worked our way through the science with king mackerel, the males, the females, age 1, age 2, CMAP stuff, some excellent work. Needs to get a little further south though. That's a problem that's not been solved. And when they get to Ponce Inlet, our area, they only go out to the one area. They don't go as far off as they did up to the north. And the bend size. I'm sorry. Fork length is what looks to be used in your analysis, but there's total length conversion, and now we have a 22-inch recreational. We still stayed with our 24-inch commercial, and part of that is so that I look at it as something at 5 pounds max for the lowest bin size, and you will rarely see that type animal except for the upper end of that category. Then the 6 to 10 inch. Well, I'm sorry, not 6 to 10 inch, but I'm sorry, 6 to 10 pounds. Everything's pounds in my brain, but you know, we're back to the 22-inch thing from the 24-inch thing. And so 11 to 15 pounds is the next bin size. And then when you get to 20, that's what we call the smokers. And generally it becomes dominated by females, bigger females than males. And CMAP has got some great stuff on the early years, age 1, age 2. And so now that I've looked at my lousy notes and I work my way through, back in the 70s when I was in the Key West area, the airplanes, the gillnet stuff, all that ended in 89. That changed a lot of stuff as far as behavior for king mackerel fishing and stuff like that. So it's become a big deal. I saw the 29-inch high average and then the lower average, but then the sample sizes across all gear types and years is questionable, but these pictures might be useful for that. And the last thing is when y'all are mentioning snappers, Julia, gray snapper mangoes is what we call them. And offshore, they were pretty nice size. They were a dominant type thing. Then you have vermilions. That's another dominant thing, but it's sort of separate from other snapper in your new category. Lane snappers, hard to see in those pictures, black and white. It's a bigger deal over in the Southwest Florida area than it is over on our side. It was like catching a yellowtail. I mounted the first yellowtail I caught, 1968. And so just trying to say that there's a lot of things that we can do to shake out a little more information for the scientists to use. When you look at the picture that's on the screen right now, you see the king mackerels, and then you see the amberjacks, and there's a barracuda over there. You know, it's the type of thing that gives you an idea of what they were doing between March and September. But I can't speak for the other time of the year. That's commercial. And commercial was the stuff that I was part of and witnessing when we were down in the Keys in the winter and up off of Upper Florida and Gulf Coast and stuff in the summer. You know, there's just different ways to fish the fish. And so the big deal is how do we get an accurate assessment and be able to know that we have balance in the population between the predators and the prey? Because right now, this red snapper thing is causing a lot of issue with things like black sea bass and on and on. So just leave it at that. The king mackerel thing's a great approach. I'm so happy that you're doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty. Lindsay wrote in the question box, how long did it take to complete the pilot project?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So we started really building the project in the summer of 2019. We kind of launched it within Zooniverse in May of 2020. It took about a year to get all the data collected via Zooniverse and with our kind of length analysts. And then it took a little while for us to kind of analyze the information. So I guess the whole process took a couple of years, but again, I think now that we've developed the processes, we have code for analysis, that things will be able to go a lot quicker on kind of many steps in the processes that were kind of developed. So hopefully, Lindsay, that answers your question.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit more, Lindsay, we were surprised on how quickly the Zooniverse volunteers actually got through the data. And Allie can probably speak to this a bit more, but we were quite often having to upload photos in a much more rapid fashion than what we were expecting. They were just flying through them. People really enjoyed being able to see these historic photos.
Yeah, and to add on that, especially with the kind of easier workflow, I think we launched the project with like 400 or 500 photos, and through the easier workflow, those photos were done within like a week. I mean, it was incredible the amount of interest folks had in this project.
Rusty, I see you have your hand raised again.
Yeah, real quick. Wasn't it 2016 when we had the big meeting where the South Atlantic Council was going to be an example to all 8 councils for the citizen science stuff?
Yeah, the first workshop that kind of was held in January of 2016 that got kind of things kicked off with the council starting a citizen science program.
Thank you. I remember that. Amber was part of that, and then the John Carmichael meeting that I had, and et cetera. So I'm so happy that this has gone along in the last 6 years. Bye.
Thanks, Rusty.
Mel, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I just wanted to congratulate Julia and the team for a great job. I mean, this was a lot of work. It was a really neat concept, and as you just mentioned, I mean, publicly of interest and desirable. But I also wanted to recognize Rusty, and you know, maybe he's not a national treasure, but he's a regional treasure for us in his you know, historian capacity. You know, he's just been a tremendous help to the council, and in this project, this was like perfect. So, Rusty, thanks so much for all you did to help things get going with this, you know, particular concept. But again, Julia and everybody involved in it, just well done. Really appreciate the effort.
Thank you, Mel.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And it was really, again, like we kind of started the presentation off, this was such a team effort by so many people. It's really exciting to see the pilot wrapping up, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of grow the project moving forward.
So, Julia, I have a question for you. What did you find the most challenging part of this project?
I think one of the most challenging pieces, and I guess, Chip, you could probably even speak to this more than me, is in kind of formatting the data and getting it ready for analysis. So when you kind of build a project in Zooniverse, the format that you kind of can easily export and download the data is really challenging to work with. I think Zooniverse has a number of resources that can help with that, but getting that in a format where we could start doing analyses was kind of one of the most challenging pieces of this project, I think, at least from my perspective. And Allie, I bet you have thoughts on that too.
Go ahead, Allie.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, I did want to comment on that because I did a lot of work in Zooniverse kind of behind the scenes and getting the project up and running in Zooniverse. And I think one of the main challenges from my perspective is thinking like a volunteer and not like a fishery scientist. And I think the pilot was a really great opportunity to learn what worked and what didn't for a really diverse group of volunteers, because Fish ID, especially in black and white photos, is quite difficult. I know even for us at times. So making sure that we kind of came at it from a point where we weren't frustrating volunteers and people felt successful really will help contribute as the project moves forward, hopefully. So that was a challenging aspect on my end.
Thank you for that. And Brian asked asked us to discuss how other anglers can get involved with this project.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. And so one of the things we're really trying to do right now is identify and collect more photos from kind of the 1940s through the 1980s. And so if any kind of anglers out there have any kind of historic photos, and we're trying to get photos at the end of a fishing trip where kind of the catch is displayed. They can reach out to me, they can email me. We're also hoping later this fall or maybe next year to start doing, look into doing kind of, I guess, scanning nights at kind of council related meetings. So maybe at some of our advisory panel meetings or at kind of council meetings, have a night where people could bring in kind of old photos and we could scan them and then provide a digital copy back to kind of the people who were providing photos and collect a little information to give us a little kind of background and context for the photos. So one way is we're really trying to kind of grow that photo set. So anyone who knows of folks or has photos themselves can just reach out to me. And we can hopefully figure out a way where we can kind of archive their photos as part of this project. And then once the project hopefully gets up and running again in Zooniverse, anglers can serve on our kind of validation team to help us kind of review some of the photos that are kind of where there's a lot of volunteer disagreement. And I know some of the fishermen who are on our validation team, when kind of Allie and I did training sessions, pointed out some kind of identification, some kind of tips for identification that I wouldn't have thought of without their input. And so I think those are two ways that anglers can kind of get involved in the project.
Thank you for that, Julia. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions come in or any hands raised. So Julia, thank you very much for a thoughtful presentation. It was very exciting to see the results from the FISHstory project, and also hear that there's potential for it to be continuing on and gathering more data.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all of you guys listening into the presentation. We kind of appreciate your interest in the project, and check us out on the council's website if you want to learn more. Oh, and Chip, I just saw this coming through the question window. There will be a recording of the presentation available. It'll be posted to the council's website later this week or early next week, maybe? I think, is that right, Chip?
It should be later this week, and
Okay.
it will be on the seminar series page. And then Rusty, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, if you could send me a link, I'd be glad to do it. I'm gonna be gone tomorrow, so maybe Thursday or Friday, send me the link. I would look forward to that.
Okay. Everyone have a good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.